first of all, let me introduce Jesselyn Radack, who is a former USA Justice Department Ethics Advisor and whistleblower. She's now the Director of National Security and Human Rights at the Government Accountability Project in the USA. She was named one of Foreign Policy magazine's 100 Leading Global Thinkers of 2013, and she was Defence Attorney for Edward Snowden and also Thomas Drake. And she writes regularly for a range of different publications in the USA. And Thomas Drake is a former senior executive at the National Security Agency, where he blew the whistle on massive multi-billion-dollar fraud, waste, and the widespread violations of the rights of citizens through secret mass surveillance programs after 9/11. As retaliation and reprisal, the Obama administration indicted Mr. Drake in 2010 as the first whistleblower since Daniel Ellsberg was charged with espionage in the United States, and he faced 35 years in prison, turning him into an enemy of the state for his oath to defend the Constitution. In 2011, the government's case against him collapsed. We can talk a little bit more about how and why that was, and he went free in a plea deal. He was a visiting professor of strategic leadership and information strategies at the National Defence University, at the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and before he was with the NSA, he was a principal in a couple of dot-coms. So, what we're going to be talking about today is whistleblowing, national security, the law, and I guess big news stories. So please join me in welcoming our speakers. Now I'm planning to run this as a conversation. At some point I'm going to throw to you guys, because I'm sure that you're going to have plenty of questions. And of course, at the moment, we're at a particular moment in the history of Australian journalism with legislation proposed which could see journalists jailed for publishing the sort of material which has been released through Edward Snowden. Jesselyn, I was wondering, first of all, have you familiarised yourself with what's proposed in Australia?
Yes, it's quite draconian, and it's scary. I think it's a backdoor way of having the equivalent of an Official Secrets Act, like they do in the UK. And I would think you would want to avoid that. To me, it's such a broadly worded piece of legislation right now that it's unclear what special intelligence information can be, and the fact that if you're speaking with the source and then you talk to your editor or your producer about doing a story, that can be criminalized, even if you never even write a story. The fact that you're discussing this information, which you may or may not know, is secret. So it's a very chilling law, the way it's written. And when I heard from one of your members of parliament, Steve Chobo, we were at Splendor in the Grass on a panel with him, and he said very matter-of-factly that yes, this would criminalize a journalist publishing disclosures like those from Edward Snowden. So that, I can't think of a more chilling way, that he admitted to that.
Is it unprecedented? Is there anywhere else in the Western world that has legislation either in place or proposed?
Well, in the United States, they've talked about having, whether or not to have like a reporter source privilege, but that's sort of a cousin issue to this, whether a reporter would have to ever testify against a source. I see that more as kind of on a parallel track, that kind of legislation, but I have not seen something this severe in any kind of Western democracy. I mean, it's antithetical to a free and open democratic society if you don't have a free press.
Yeah. Now, Tom, turning back to the sort of roots of your personal history, I guess, with the media and whistleblowing, I think this audience is going to be particularly interested in the sorts of things that go through your mind and the sorts of actions you take when you're deciding whether or not to blow the whistle. Can you sort of walk us through your own thought processes from what's now several years ago?
Well, the first thing, any consideration, given where I used to work as a senior executive in a national security agency, a super secret agency, bound by certain protocols, certain administrative rules, bound by, as I was, individuals who are employed by NSA, you have to sign non-disclosure agreements. So even thinking about, just the first thing I want to say, that even considering or thinking about going to the press is fraught with enormous peril. It's something we would call the third rail, the electric rail. You don't touch it without enormous consequences. And I was presented by the stark reality that my own government had jettisoned the Constitution after 9/11, and that in the deepest of secrecy, the White House had decided that essentially, and I'm going to use really stark language because here I am in Australia, and I recognize you don't have a constitution like we do with a Bill of Rights. In fact, maybe you could use our Bill of Rights because the government doesn't want to use them in our country. Maybe there's a need for them here, at least a place they can live. I was confronted by the stark reality that the government had unchained itself from the Constitution in the deepest of secrecy, that it was actually in the way. And if I had remained silent, now this is, I'm in the government shortly after 9/11, the stark reality of what the government is doing under the rubric, under the mantle of national security, separate from the Constitution and turn the United States of America into the equivalent of a foreign nation for dragging electronic surveillance on an extraordinarily vast scale, a scale by which I have to say right now has still not been fully revealed in spite of the extraordinary Edward Snowden disclosures from over a year ago now. I was eyewitness to the very foundational programs, the original set of mass surveillance programs. And so what do? Well, there were avenues within the government, and besides multi-billion-dollar fraud, and it was a boondoggle program, and then also the other fact was NSA had critical intelligence about 9/11. That was part of my whistleblowing. So what do? Well, most people don't do anything. That's a fact. They don't. This is super secret stuff going on within the government. It's 9/11. Daniel Ellsberg would have been the first to tell you because he himself went through channels, right? He went to other parts of the government trying to bring up the bright and shining lie of Vietnam to no avail. I ended up blowing the whistle through every possible channel that existed. So I chose not to remain silent. I chose to actually hold up a mirror and say, government, just because you're hiding behind the veil of secrecy or using the veil of secrecy as an excuse to violate the law. And the critical statute here had to do with what's called in America the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And the reason it came about was because of abuses during the 60s and 70s. And we had a president in our country who resigned, President Nixon, and I was a very young adult growing up then. So part of my context here was given by what my own civic awakening several decades earlier. Now here I am confronted by my own government secrets saying, hey, all this law stuff is null and void, the statutes are null and void, we just want the data. So what do? Well, I started blowing the whistle. I went to my boss. I went to the Inspector General's office. I went to the Office of General Counsel. I had a rather dramatic confrontation on the phone with the lead attorney for this secret surveillance program at NSA. I ended up, long story short, as a material witness on 2 9/11 congressional investigations, giving him thousands of pages of documentation, both hard copy and soft copy, on all of this and then some. I ended up as a whistleblower on the Department of Defense audit / investigation on this multi-billion-dollar boondoggle called Trailblazer, when a $3.2 million program had already solved the requirements, had protected the constitutional rights of citizens, and provided superior intelligence. So all this takes place, as well as other avenues in which I had direct contact with the staffers for the oversight committees in Congress, making sure that the secret side of government remained within its bounds, its prescribed bounds. This went on for several years, and I got to a point in 2005, and shortly after the publication in the New York Times of the article which revealed for the first time publicly the existence of a warrantless wiretapping program, and had the last whistle I actually blew at NSA was the former director of NSA, General Keith Alexander, and a letter I wrote. That letter ended up essentially terminating my position at NSA, and I had to seek other employment, which is how I ended up at the National Defense University. So out of sight, out of mind. Remember, I'm still within channels. I have not touched the third rail. Well, that's interesting. Even the third rail was you go to the press, which is what Ellsberg did. Ellsberg ultimately chose to go to the press, got charged with espionage. Now, I was well aware of that. I knew that if I went to the press, given the climate, given the fact that there was these incredibly secret and constitutional violating programs that were been playing out for 4 years plus, if I went to the press, it was fraught with enormous peril. And I chose to go because what I knew in terms of secret surveillance, what I knew in terms of the massive fraud at the level of many billions of dollars, and what I knew about the cover-up of, in terms of NSA's own culpability in failing to prevent 9/11. You had critical intelligence, tragically enough, that was not properly shared within channels. I knew that if I touched that rail, right, that I could see the government coming after me, and up to and including espionage. I knew that.
If I could just pause you there
Sure.
for a moment. The letter which you say terminated your employment, was it put to you in those terms, or
Well, it was clear. I was told by the senior executive, who was actually in charge of senior executive assignments, because there's only a couple hundred of us, and he made it crystal clear that there was no position at NSA for you.
Yeah.
And this opportunity came up to teach at the university as a visiting professor of behavioral science, which I did. And for them, that was fine because it was sort of out of sight, out of mind.
End of problem. Yeah.
End of problem.
Now,
But what they didn't know is that during this period, which I had ended up with no job at NSA, I did go to the press
okay.
anonymously.
So can you tell us why you did that and how you did it?
Look, I couldn't live with myself if, after having exhausted all government channels with all these violations and fraud and cover-up, I couldn't live with myself in terms of history. Knowing that these decisions that made in the deepest secrecy had enormous strategic consequences downstream. And here I was now over, we're talking 4.5 years later, I made the fateful decision to go to the press. And it was in the public interest. It was fundamentally in the public interest. That the public, the American citizens, had a right to know what the government had been doing all these many years in its name, under the veil of national security.
So your first contact with the journalist was anonymous?
Totally anonymous.
Did the journalist know who you were?
No.
And which journalist did you go to, and how did you?
Well, I went to, there was a reporter. I did not go to the New York Times. The government actually thought, that's a whole nother chapter, that they really thought that I was the source of the New York Times. I had no contact. So I went to a reporter with the Baltimore Sun in Maryland, which was like the local newspaper for that area. It was under the Tribune. There's sort of the conglomerate.
It's the backyard of the NSA.
But it's, yes.
So it's there.
So it was really the paper of record, although the Post, but the Baltimore Sun was more of the local paper.
And I imagine you were weighing all this up.
I weighed all this. I actually spent several months deciding. This is even before the New York Times article came out, because I made the decision that I would go to the press in November of 2005. I actually made that, but I just had to figure out what was the best way to do it. And then once I chose which reporter, which was Siobhan Gorman, who now is a national security correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, how would I contact her? I couldn't just show up at the Tribune office complex in downtown DC where she worked, because there's a ledger and you have to sign in with a security guard and there are security cameras.
So why did you choose her?
She had been writing a series of articles about Trailblazer, this multi-billion-dollar boondoggle, and she'd be writing a lot of articles about mismanagement at NSA, and it was clear that she had sources, and I was not one of her sources. What she didn't know was the rest of the story. What she didn't know was the secret surveillance programs. What she didn't know is that there was alternatives. What she didn't know was that there was an answer to Trailblazer, and had been for many, many years. She didn't know all this, and she didn't know about the 9/11 cover-up.
But her reporting, as you saw it, was accurate and fair, and you felt that gave her a track record to trust her?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was her beat.
It was her beat, and although she was working out of the DC office, right, she was not actually in Baltimore. So I contacted her anonymously, and I had anonymous communications with her.
Phone or email? Or?
It was email.
So you set up an anonymous
Yeah, it's a
email
long
account?
story. It's quite technical, although it's fascinating in its own right. I am writing a book about this with Jesselyn. Just can't find a publisher yet after 2.5 years. Well, no one wants to touch it. It's sort of this third rail. Publishers are afraid of the government. We've been told that. Or they say your story's already been told and have no idea about all the backstories. So I had to figure out a way, and given my own technical background, I have been heavily involved in information technology, as well as systems and software engineering. I had analyzed all kinds of code when I was on a special project under Al Gore's Reinventing Government initiative during the 1990s. I actually led a software engineering center as a senior executive, ironically enough, the very center where I worked as a contractor for a number of years. And so I was well versed in all of the internet in the digital age. I had gone digital, as it were, many years earlier. In fact, I had email accounts before internet was even popular. So I ended up figuring out that the best way to contact her was through encryption. I had to do it anonymously. And that was a fairly laborious process because I had to make initial contact with her with a regular email, and in a way that would not alert the surveillance system, knowing that they were actually, and this is something that has not been fully revealed, I've talked about this publicly, NSA had a special program that was essentially doing mass surveillance on most of the journalists that mattered. And I'm hoping in the Edward Snowden disclosures, I have not seen it yet, that this comes out. I certainly had the documentation when I was in the system, and I gave this to the investigators, right? This is one of the things is like, well, if there's no evidence and you can't prove that we're actually doing this. NSA realized with all of these secret domestic surveillance programs that there was a risk they would ultimately get exposed. And of course, one of the ways in which they could at least get alerted to that was to monitor journalists and reporters, their phone numbers, and email accounts. So I devised a way in which I could contact the reporter anonymously through encrypted means, in which only she would have a reasonable understanding of a question I asked her. Only she could reasonably know what that answer was. Now, of course, she didn't know me. And I took a risk that if she didn't know the answer to the question, I'd be stuck. Because I'd only have basically one chance for her to answer the question, which would open up this encrypted email that would give her very specific instructions on how to set up what was the real encryption that was carefully prescribed. It was actually very similar. I haven't said this yet. You can smile, Jess. The way in which Edward Snowden actually gave very specific instructions to Glenn Greenwald about setting up encryption. I gave those types of instructions, okay, to Siobhan Gorman.
Because step number one is verifying identity, which becomes complicated when your source wants to remain anonymous. You ask a question. I can communicate with a client and say, what color is my hair? And they can answer, or something they may know. How many kids do I have? Or something that I may have mentioned to them that but.
And I couldn't trust the computer she worked on. I knew that they were compromised, and I knew that she was monitored. See, I knew that she was monitored. NSA was monitoring her. She was already tagged by NSA by virtue of all these articles she was publishing in the Baltimore Sun about NSA, and NSA didn't like it. And they were the word had already spread. This is actually in 2005. Who the heck is she talking to at NSA? And I knew there was already a surveillance system in place, in fact, been in place for several years, to specifically monitor and persistently monitor the electronic transactions of journalists, particularly email accounts and phone numbers.
So having made that initial contact, how did things proceed from there? She presumably answered the question. What was the question?
She did. Well, I won't, because, to protect. It was a question related to where she used to work. And it was a very specific question that only she could really answer. And because I had to assume that it was possible the government could compromise the communication with her, and if the only way they could truly compromise it was they would have to have hijacked her email account, and the chances of that happening at that point were actually fairly slim. That they actually owned her account, but they could certainly capture the email at center, although it was encrypted. So unless they broke that encryption, they wouldn't be able to know what the question was I had asked of her. So she answered the question correctly, And it took several weeks though for her to set up, because I had very, very specific instructions. To set up was a rather complex set of procedures in creating a anonymized email account, utilizing an overseas server, non-US. There was a very specific reason for that. And then communicating with me through a series of text messages to ensure that it could actually work. So for a year, we had communication without her knowing who I was. And I provided her during that 1 year period a lot of unclassified. The agreement was, it's ironic because the government discovered in my computers, they were able to discover what they call slack memory. This was unallocated memory, actually unallocated space on the computer hard drive, that I had actually had a snippet. They had one snippet. It was they were able to recover, which was actually the rules by which I would engage with her, which said I would never provide you anything that was classified. Now, of course, to the government, ultimately it didn't matter. So I provided her all the critical information I could regarding the secret surveillance programs. Unfortunately, much of that never actually got published because the editors kiboshed it. They were afraid of the government. That's one of the backstories here. But she did publish in May of 2006, revealing for the first time publicly that there was an alternative to the secret surveillance program, which was actually much larger than what the New York Times had revealed. And that there was a program that not only satisfied the requirements for trailblazers with this multi-billion-dollar program, but also absolutely had built into its rule set the protection of citizen rights. This is probable cause threshold, and it would have provided superior intelligence. So she published this article in May of 2006. I was already I was already on the radar of the government. The government was really ultimately was targeting people. Anybody that had any knowledge of any type regarding the secret surveillance programs. They were actually less interested, as it turns out, in the fact that there was this billion-dollar boondoggle, because that was like, yeah, we spent a lot of money, it didn't result in anything, too bad. It was a hard problem, we couldn't solve it, at least at that time. They still can't solve it, but that's a whole other story. So I shared all this I've been sharing it. So that began a series of articles that were published by the Baltimore Sun, and of course, these articles now really put her in the spotlight. And it is true that it became a trigger event for the government to focus on who at NSA was providing her all this information. Because I recognized I was a primary source. I was not the only source, but I was a primary source. One of the rules was I would never serve as the only source. That there was always another source for her articles.
And how did you go public? At what point did you go public, and how did that happen?
Well, see, I ultimately say public. I went public when the FBI raided me in 2007. Now, so that's you're talking a year and a half later. In between this, as I actually revealed myself to the reporter, but she agreed that I would never my name because I was still employed by NSA. They would have fired me immediately. So she agreed to continue to keep me anonymous in terms of sourcing, and there was agreements about how that would normally show up. Senior official, defense official. There were several ways in which you could mask identity. But the fact was, I was under the gun, and I knew as early as April of 2006 that I was a person of interest in this very large, multi-million-dollar, multi-year investigation that had been launched shortly after the publication of the New York Times article, and they were seeking the sources for that article. And I got caught up in that investigation, and in the long story short, November of 2007, I had the FBI raid my house and my university office simultaneously, and the nightmare began. That's after my colleagues, former NSA colleagues, had been raided, as well as the NSA staffer who's now retired at this point, had been retired for a number of years, 5 years plus, who knew about the secret surveillance programs. So I became public at that point, but no one knew the details. 2.5 years later, after the government attempted to have me plead out to many years in prison, they ultimately indicted me for espionage in April of 2010, and then that's when I went completely public.
Yeah.
So I did not go public by choice. I ended up going public because the government put me on the front page of many newspapers across the country. It's important to note, I mean, it's still surreal for me. This is a little over 4 years ago. I was the first whistleblower since Ellsberg that was charged with espionage in this manner. And he was declared the most dangerous man in America by Henry Kissinger. I was ultimately declared an enemy of the state. But this is April of 2010. The collateral murder video had come out from Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. But you did not have the rest of Manning. Chelsea Manning took place shortly after I was indicted. This is before all the other whistleblowers were indicted, charged and indicted with espionage. This is well before John Kiriakou, and this is clearly years before Edward Snowden.
Yeah.
So it was so rare in American history that in terms of the press reporting, the government held the high ground here because they made it crystal clear that I was a really, really bad guy and that I had divulged information. The government actually charged me in a very interesting manner. It was for retention, but for the purpose of disclosure. They kind of bastardized even the Espionage Act because I technically wasn't charged with leaking. Okay, in fact, there is no actual code that crime called leaking. But here I am charged with espionage, and so you had mainstream media who accepted the government mean by virtue of how rare it was in U.S. history to get charged in this manner, thinking, God, this guy's must be really, really bad. And they were firing multiple broadsides because they held the high ground. They had Laney Brewer, who was the head of the criminal division. He reported directly to Eric Holder as Attorney General in the United States, the chief law enforcement officer of the land, saying that I was just a really, really bad guy and I was a traitor. And
you have the public indictment, that's public.
Really
and
bad.
Then you have them making their press speech when they charge you, and then again when they indict you. So they have all these chances at the microphone. And the number one piece of advice a criminal defense attorney will give you is don't say anything because you might accidentally reveal more information that they can charge you with, or reveal basically information they can impeach something you say with. So you only have one side of the story out there, and that's what's been so key in whistleblower cases. I mean, the media can very much be a propaganda machine for the government, and certain news organs are far more guilty of this than others. But the media can also be the saving grace. And Jane Mayer of the New Yorker, when I had been a whistleblower, she had done a story about the American Taliban and John Walker Lyndon. She was able to verify my allegations that basically evidence was withheld from the court, that this man was interrogated without an attorney and tortured. And I consider her one of the handful, fewer than 10, safe journalists that I will actually take a whistleblower to in the US. That's how few of them there are.
And what marks her out, Jesselyn, I wanted to bring you in because I assume it's at this point that you came in to the story, but just backtracking on what you just said, what marks her out for you?
For her, I felt like, unlike, I had blown the whistle to Mike Isikoff, who at that point was a journalist with Newsweek, and he took my leak, my whistleblower disclosure, and he wrote a really good article about it. And he asked if I wanted to be quoted in the article, and I said, won't that point a big red arrow at me as being your source? And he said, yeah, and I said, well then no, I absolutely don't want to be quoted. But then he published the emails I leaked in full with my name on Newsweek's website. Yeah. So when you burn a source, I'm never taking a whistleblower to you again. Believe me, he's always knocking at my door saying, later on he did do a good whistleblower piece on someone else's client.
Was that a mistake on his part, or was it?
I think it was probably him not coordinating with the social media. Was pretty new at the social media platform part of news organizations back in 2002. It was a sort of just 2001, late 2001, early 2002 beginning. I think it was a mistake. I don't think it was on purpose, but the fact that you would burn a source or not be looking out more carefully, I mean, that's certainly a factor. When Tom was talking about negotiating rules, Tom came up with his own set of rules that I thought was brilliant about, I'm not going to give you classified, I'm not going to be a sole source, his own rules. But I think the rules that we in America at least try to negotiate with journalists tend to be very mushy. What off the record is versus on deep background versus on background versus for attribution but disguised versus anonymous. And a lot of different reporters have different definitions of what these things mean, and we have to be very, I mean, from a client perspective, very careful with nailing that down. You know, if someone's going to be, you know, and even though the government's quoted anonymously every single day, they don't like it if a whistleblower is anonymous. So being able to give identifying information, like a former government official at an intelligence agency is obviously more obscure than a senior executive with the NSA, which is more obscure than, you know, a signal intelligence directorate insider.
So having had that awful experience, what made you choose this journalist?
With Jane, because I felt like she, first of all, she showed up on my doorstep. I wasn't home. She wrote this long handwritten, you know, note to me, as if I didn't know who Jane Mayer was. She was one of the most famous investigative journalists. I had studied her in law school and read her book that she wrote on a different subject, and but just very humble. Took the time to actually come to my house and write a long note saying, you know, I've heard it, she had heard about the Newsweek article and read that. I think you know information that may be prescient. You know, I think you were very prescient in identifying this issue, and I think you know more information that to the story, and I'm doing this long-form journalistic piece. And then we met, and she wasn't hounding me from the get-go. I didn't have that feeling that I've had with other journalists and whistleblowers where they're sort of like, tell me more, tell me more, tell me more, to the point that it feels like they're not looking out for protecting you. She was very much made me feel protected and very much deferred to limits and ground rules of I don't want to go there. She wouldn't try to backdoor me and make me go somewhere where I said, I mean, I was under a gag order that I couldn't talk about a word that begins with T. I still can't, as far as I know, even though it's commonly talked about as one of the biggest scandals.
Otherwise known as torture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wasn't going to put you on the spot.
So I can reveal that. She's under a gag order.
I speak about it, but not with respect to that particular but the details of what happened in that particular case. But I felt like when I tried to, you know, when I told her, like, look, I cannot talk about the actual interrogation itself, she respected that, and she wasn't trying to backdoor me or trick me or whatever. And I felt like she very much dug into, she did gumshoe research. I mean, it wasn't like, I've seen a lot of lazy journalism where they kind of, I mean, they get the facts of Tom's case wrong all the time, and it's years after, and I still have to send in corrections time and again, over and over, because of basic fact, like, oh, he was indicted for leaking. No, he was actually indicted for retaining information. So that's even scarier, that you're indicted for just having a copy of something.
Actually made it worse.
Even worse.
Yeah.
You know, with the intention, trying to divine what your human intentions are in the future. But yeah, journalists get basic facts of Tom's case wrong, even now. And I felt like she was incredibly precise and very, you know, taking measures to protect source material in terms of who she'd been talking with. And I could tell she'd been talking with his parents, and I could tell she let me know enough without really ever telling me, like, yes, I am speaking with his parents, but from things I just had a trust that developed over a number of meetings with her.
Sure, understood. Now, taking it forward a little bit, Edward Snowden, did he talk to you before he did what he did? To either of you?
No.
No,
So
but it turns out that he had followed my case very, very closely. And at the HopeX, there was a conversation between him, HopeX hacker conference in New York City we were at, spoke at. There was a conversation between Edward Snowden and Daniel Ellsberg. And he made it crystal clear during that conversation that I had showed him the right way to do things. Because he had followed my case very, very closely. He saw what had happened to me going through every channel that existed. And he knew, given the explosive nature of what he had found out, which was really the metastasization of these surveillance programs in the intervening decade plus, where I was there at the very beginning, the very genesis of these programs, and saw them grow in the early years. He now is there seeing what happened, and now is this global platform, the surveillance platform. Not only we're mass surveilling our own country, we're now exporting that to other countries and mass surveilling in fact, in some cases, entire countries overseas, including the information and data on citizens. So he saw what happened to me, and it's quite clear that he realized he could not. And as it turned out, he attempted. There were attempts by him to bring attention within the system, but ultimately he made a critical choice himself, a fateful choice to leave the United States after he had worked out protocols with the reporters of record that we know, Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald is the primary two, to meet him in Hong Kong. And he had to escape the United States.
And that seems to be one of the differences between him and you, that he actually consciously went to Hong Kong, which is a media hub in the world, and was very active in managing the continuing story.
Because I think he saw what happened to me and how close I came to being placed in prison for many years. And he saw all the restrictions that I had my passport confiscated. I was put under severe travel restrictions. The government had right of first refusal. I couldn't even leave the United States. I had no means to do so.
Chelsea Manning was being tortured.
Right, you have to remember what the other cases that had transpired. So he saw what had happened, all this. The only chance he had, and even that was fraught with risk, was to leave the United States.
Yeah.
But again, the media, it comes full circle, because as soon as he went public, he did that when he unveiled himself in that video by Laura Poitras and said, I think I'm going to be called a traitor, I'm going to be accused of espionage. Again, this is where I immediately said, in my mind, as a whistleblower advocate at a whistleblower advocacy organization, I immediately held a press conference with Tom and Bill Binney and Kirk Wiebe, three whistleblowers from the NSA who had all gone through the system and all been screwed, and all said unequivocally in front of a bank of cameras and on the front page of USA Today, which has I think the biggest circulation in the US.
Extremely wide circulation. You pretty much find it anywhere, gas stations.
What was the headline of that? We support Snowden, or he learned from us. It was a great headline. I don't know why I'm not thinking of it right now on the cover of USA Today. He did this the right way.
Yeah.
So that hopefully that would generate an initial, at least.
We told you so.
We told you so was the headline,
so.
right? And but it again was a way to at least. All you had was a government saying the sky is falling and our enemies are going to attack us, and this person, whoever did this, is going to be responsible for the next 9/11. It was our way of just firing a shot across the bow and trying to frame this person as a whistleblower and shape the story that way.
Now I could go on, but I do want to leave time to open it to questions, because I can see that they're brewing. Edward Snowden's position now, what do you think the future holds, and how is it?
I think he's doing fine. I think for Edward, it's a long distance run, not a sprint. I think he'll end up staying in Russia, having his asylum extended, or in some other way staying. Russia has indicated it's glad to have him stay, and I don't feel like he is safe in any other country in the world right now that has offered asylum.
You don't think he's safe anywhere else?
Well, the only other ones that have offered asylum are all in South America. Venezuela is very politically unstable, and I don't think, there are agents all over South America, US agents, so I do worry, not that they would extradite him, but that he would somehow be rendered or worse.
Yeah. Just one last question for me, because I don't want to open it up. Broadly speaking, are you optimists that information of this kind will get out, and that some would argue that with WikiLeaks and with the technological tools at our disposal now, that Edward Snowden or Thomas Drake can get the information out, or are you pessimists because of the increasing activism of government?
People are still walking through my door, and people from national security and intelligence agencies, and I think I mean, the government doesn't understand that the unintended consequence of these witch hunts on people is that it actually makes other people more willing to come forward in some ways. So I'm hopeful. After Chelsea Manning, I didn't think an event like that would happen again for another 40 years. And the fact that it happened a couple of years later, was pretty amazing. Dan Ellsberg said, after Chelsea Manning, I never thought in my lifetime that I would see anything of that magnitude. And then Snowden happened, and it's literally changed. Most people don't get to change the world and at least see that they changed it during their own lifetime. So I feel like he is where he needs to be right now. I don't think that precludes sometime in the future, in another decade or so, being able to return to the U.S. or another country that would be hospitable and strong enough to defend him.
Yes, we'll take a change of tide. Okay, questions from you guys? I'm sure there are some. I've got plenty more of you. Haven't got any?
Well, I've got three.
Yes, this is Dennis Mullen, teacher's art.
Law and ethics here. I'm very interested in your description of your workings, Thomas, through the whistleblower protection avenues, sort of official avenues, which are very parallel to our laws here, our whistleblower laws here. There's no protection at all for whistleblowers to go to the media. It's the third rail problem. And I was wondering, from the experience of both of you, what would be the characteristics of a really good, effective whistleblower legal regime?
I think a good whistleblower law would have an affirmative public interest defense if you were to be prosecuted criminally. I mean, the problem with the U.S. whistleblower laws is they don't apply to national security and intelligence employees who are exempted from the law. And even if they were included in the law doesn't have any kind of affirmative action you can take when the government does retaliate. It just says the government may not retaliate against you, but when they do, there's nothing, it doesn't create an independent cause of action that you can bring. I'm a legal ethicist also, so I've thought about this a lot. When Tom was going through channels internally, he was doing that on his own. Most of our whistleblowers, I would say 95% or more, come to us after they're being retaliated against, not prospectively before they blow the whistle, which, if they do that, I can think of other ways that we can try to insulate them more. Maybe going to the media, but also going to a congressperson before going to the media, a congressperson who happens to like a particular issue that they're concerned about. Denial of veterans, ill treatment of veterans in the hospital. Go to a congressman who's sympathetic with that, and then when nothing happens, then be able to go public with the letter to the congressman and the response and the back and forth. And there are ways to insulate you and make it safer as a whistleblower. Obviously, if you're a corporate whistleblower or at some other non-national security agency, you have better protection than if you're a national security or intelligence employee.
Can I just ask one supplementary? Thomas, when you went internally, what was the response? What sort of responses did you get when you went down that internal level?
Yeah, most people still don't get this, and this is where the system is absolutely corrupt. There were supposed to be independent channels, but I was flagged early on. In fact, during the time in which I was a cooperating witness and a whistleblower with the 9/11 congressional investigations, the very first one in which I participated, and of course our Congress has subpoena power, I was approached by, quite directly by my immediate supervisor, the number 3 person in NSA, and said, "Tom, be careful, they're looking for leakers." Now this wasn't leakers to the press, this was leakers to Congress. So they wanted me to obstruct an official 9/11 congressional investigation, which I absolutely refused to do, but the message was crystal clear. Be careful. Yeah, we're on to you. And that was very early on. This is something people don't fully appreciate. I haven't discussed all of this. Some of this I write about in the book. How far the government went to destroy me even before I went to the press, because they realized that going even outside NSA to Congress or going outside NSA to the Department of Defense would bring information to light. And so they had this extraordinary effort in place to track anybody and everybody that had any kind of contact with any of those agencies, and they had the means to do it. It's one of the deeper, darker truths here of what happens to a whistleblower within the national security regime. So even if I use the formal statute that I employed it was passed in 1998. It's called the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act. The problem was it did not provide, as Jesselyn mentioned, the protections that were necessary in case you truly were retaliated against. I could not go to a court of law. This is all secret stuff. And of course they were on to me. So what do you do? I mean, the system's corrupt, right? So all the information I gave Congress was censored and suppressed. All the information that I gave the Department of Defense, Office Inspector General, it turns out, as we found out, much to our shock, a dramatic announcement by the chief prosecutor several months before my scheduled public trial during the discovery phase. Oh, all that stuff that Mr. Drake gave the Department of Defense, it's been destroyed. Destroyed. So then you get into what we call Bradley Gigula, which is actually exculpatory information. It's either been destroyed or withheld by the prosecution, which in itself is a violation of due process. So you're really caught in this Kafkaesque world that if you hold up a mirror within the system, you're tagged as a troublemaker, you're tagged as a dissenter, you're tagged as someone who you have to be very careful of, because you're not a team player and you're not going along with the institution, right? You're not obeying authority. So it's extraordinarily challenging, particularly in the post 9/11 world, for anybody in the national security regime, knowing that if you go to the press, you will be no doubt brought up on criminal charges. And even within the system, as I found out, I ended up with no job. Right? So most people don't do it. But that's the tragic reality here, and all you're doing is attempting to right what the government goes off the rails in terms of law, and its own constitution, but it's all done in secret.
It's death by 1,000 paper
Right.
cuts when people go through channels. Oh, they get demoted into some meaningless feather bedding position, doing nothing. They're paying someone $200,000 a year to like stack paper cups in his office. I mean, seriously, these are real life.
I ended up
Things
in
that
early
happen.
2006, after my final whistleblowing act was writing this letter to Keith Alexander. I ended up with no job. I had my senior, I was flag rank, so I had a flag and a desk and a computer. They had stripped away all my programs. I no longer held I was in the director of engineering. It was a very technical position at the time. I had no staff, I had no secretary, I had no money. I had been, as they say, laterally arabesqued. Yeah. And that is the ultimate price you pay in the bureaucracy. They couldn't fire me, but they could certainly make it where I had no job left, and the message was crystal clear. In fact, I was told by the executive in charge of executive assignments, we don't want you here anymore. He actually said that. There's no job for you here anymore.
So, Thomas, how were you not destroyed by all of these? What is it that I suppose there's?
Well, I sit down, I stand up. I stand before you as a free human being, right? I'm in Australia as a free human being. I just kept standing up. I would not bow before the secret authorities. I was not going to let them destroy my life. Did they destroy my life? Yes. I mean, Jesselyn knows the dark details of how far the government went to, because I had to share all this with her in order to provide for the public defense. She led my defense in the court of public opinion. That was ultimately the last place I could go. There was no other avenue. The avenue was cast your lot, and which meant you had to go to the press, you had to go to alternative media, you had to go to the mainstream media, you had to influence and shape that, because I was a leaker, I was this traitor, I was an enemy of the state. Jess, with her extraordinary leadership, even the mainstream media in the end finally realized I was a whistleblower, and that, guess what? The press does have an interest in what goes on inside government. I just literally kept standing up. I was not going to let the government put me in a box, and I was not going to have them charge me with espionage. I just kept standing up, but I recognize how extraordinarily fortunate I am, and you probably even when I say that here in my body language before you, I'm amazingly fortunate. I really am. because most people end up in prison. Most people end up pleading out, all right? Because the pressures are enormous. I mean, they stripped me of all my jobs. I could not find any other work in the government, even before I was indicted. I formed my own company, which still exists, but I was unable to get any work for it. I even had partnerships with other companies, and they would mysteriously separate me out because to go forward would jeopardize their ability to actually win the contract or even bid on it, as it turned out. Every liquid asset I owned, I was a senior executive. I actually took a huge salary cut from industry. I was consulting in Silicon Valley during the go-go 90s. We're talking tens upon thousands of dollars, was spent on private defense attorney during the 2-year period. I was declared indigent before the court. That should tell you something, right? I had no other assets. Indigent. I had no ability to pay for a private attorney at the point they actually secretly charged me before they indicted me. So not only are you broken, right? Not only are you effectively bankrupt, but not only are you blacklisted, you now face the prospect that you're going to end up, in prison. So I wasn't going to let that happen. I took, but the price is enormous. I mean, I think part of the fact that I'm free should tell you is that it is possible that you can stand up. But this is extraordinarily. You're talking about the kind of power that has there's no pretense in the use of it, right? I'll try to make this a little, just because you're asking something because of what I lived through, and here I am in Australia free to share it with you. Imagine for the moment, the government has this incredibly powerful digital lifestyle microscope, and they simply drill down into your life over a 4-year period, literally a 4-year period, to learn everything there is to know about you.
And then recasting that in ways
And
that
then
are
framing you
nefarious,
to make you, yes.
innocent, innocuous things that you would do. Even during my own whistleblowing, they were like, oh, she's a single mother of 2 children whose husband left her to go on travel. I'm like, no, he works at the World Bank and he has to travel for long missions as part of his job. But they would take these regular facts and totally twist them into something nefarious, and this has happened numerous times in Ed's case. But at the same time with Tom, I knew he had to win not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, and the media was key to that. And it was very key to strategically try to line up as best I could before the trial. Boom, boom, boom. He was winning the Rittenhour Prize for truth-telling, which I knew would get media. And they'd have to say, Tom Drake, not someone charged with the Espionage Act. They'd have to say, Tom Drake, winner of the Rittenhour Prize for truth-telling. Some papers would have to say that. The New Yorker article, and then a 60 Minutes piece on television afterwards. And I always say print comes before TV in my book when I try to plan out some sort of media strategy. Another thing about Jane is she was high enough level journalist that she knew a lot of contacts in the government, but she wasn't subservient to them. And I could tell that from her other writing in a piece she had recently done on Eric Holder. I knew she was capable and known for not just obeying authority to the degree that a lot of well-known journalists for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and LA Times, Wall Street Journal are. And I knew the New Yorker, as an organ, as a media outlet, would be able to reach the people, the decision makers that were calling the shots in his case. If it had been placed in a different, a newspaper would have come and gone in one day if it were a long-form newspaper piece. A magazine, they sit around doctors' offices they're out there for they have a longer shelf life. And sometimes with some clients, a newspaper hard hit is what you need. Other times a long-form investigative journalistic piece is what you need.
What role, if any, does social media play these days in the court of public opinion? Yeah.
I think huge.
That was another, Jess was, just brilliant. You're brilliant. Here I am, I can't say enough about Jess's role. She was my voice when I had none, and she brilliantly led this strategy in the court of public opinion, and part of that was social media. And she was savvy enough, in a partnership with others, a small team that was very well placed to directly influence social media, and we're talking about new social media. Getting out the message, getting out ahead of the government. The government just couldn't turn fast enough. And that was a huge advantage in not only countering the government's memes, and countering the government's claims in my case, but also beginning to slowly turn my case around to where, wait a minute, the government was involved in violations of law, the government was involved in significant wrongdoing, the government did in fact spend billions on a boondoggle, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So part of it was countering, and that did turn the ship. I mean, right before my scheduled public trial, the Washington Post, which was the paper of record for DC, quite conservative as it turns out, tends to give power a lot of due deference, unfortunately, wrote these two very powerful op-eds, and they basically said, government, maybe you have overreached. Government, maybe he's not a leaker, he really is a whistleblower. Government, just in case you forgot, we're protected by the First Amendment, and we do have an interest in what's going on inside government in the public interest. So this was sending a message, right? It didn't stop the government in terms of pursuing other cases, I know that, but I recognize I was an anchor case. I mean, one of the things that was crystal clear here is that if the government was able to win, in my case, it would have set a very rapid precedent. There would have been no impediments to the government in widening even the aperture of what they would go after people for. And so it was absolutely crucial. I knew it, but there was no guarantees. I knew there was no assurances. I just knew that the Court of Public Opinion is ultimately where this would be decided. I had to have criminal defense attorneys in the courtroom. That ultimately were public defenders. The public defenders were severely challenged by my case. There had been no case in that particular court in Baltimore, Maryland that was involving national security like this. They had to come up to speed. They had to get security clearances. The government built a $400,000 special facility to contain all this alleged classified. So the two little offices inside the court building. And yeah, that went on for 14 months. And for 14 months, I faced a distinct prospect that everything I'd taken oath to defend was going to be taken away from me personally. So what matters? I mean, I'm free. I can't tell you what it means to be a free, sovereign human being, where the government was doing everything to take away on a very personal level, because that was the punishment for holding up the mirror. But in the end, Jess is right. In the end, the press was a saving grace. In the end, it was the press that got the word out regarding the truth about my case.
But they didn't, sorry to overhear, but they didn't for years. That's what I'm saying. I mean,
Yeah, 3 years.
Sorry, I'm just going to fly to you or something.
Right.
I mean, a couple of things. One, you talk about the government, right? Which I sit there and think the government's, that's such a who. Like the government.
The Justice Department,
Justice
Eric
Department,
Holder.
Like
the White House.
But specific individuals must have
Very specific individual.
targeted or put your name in the.
Oh, they did. No, I know all the names. All the names. I know the senior leadership at NSA, who have just recently retired. That was Chris English, the deputy director. The director was Keith Alexander. Before that.
How much of that do you think, though? I have another question
Sure.
about the meeting in a second, but how much of those individual people put this up as a personal agenda to bring you down?
It was partly that. No, it was.
That's what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, there's no question that, because I knew this from the inside, that the word had gotten out. See here, at the highest levels, it was Cheney. A very well-placed source, a very extraordinarily well-connected, had come to me privately and said, Tom, you need to understand something. Cheney, when he found out about the New York Times article, he gave out the word within the intelligence community, find and fry the leakers. I don't care who it is, make an object lesson and burn them. So it was personal for him. That was translated because clearly NSA was ticked off that someone was actually revealing or knew about, in particular, these secret mass surveillance programs. They didn't want this to go unpunished.
The individuals in my case all got promoted.
Right.
So I mean, for them, to some degree, it is personal, and it's about climbing the career ladder with the case of a lifetime prosecuting Edward Snowden. and that's going to be how they make their name. And so it's hard to sometimes separate the personal from, you're supposed to be an objective lawyer when you work for the Justice Department, but obviously there are big cases that come along, and it can really make you as an attorney and shape your career. But I do think they try to make object lessons that people like Tom Drake and John Walker Lynn, the American Taliban, and Edward Snowden, names that we know. The names of a lot of these people: Julian, Snowden. I mean, I can say these to anyone on the street, and people are going to know who I'm talking about. I was in India. Goes to social media. So I was in like Old Delhi. Not New Delhi, Old Delhi, like everyone's poor as dirt, but everyone has a cell phone. And there are portraits of Edward Snowden all over the place. And that was social media at work. I mean, it certainly wasn't being written about in the Indian press.
Now I'm keen that we open it up to a few more questions because we are running out of time. Karati, then Gary, and then Daryl.
Whistleblowing is for public interest. In your case, I want to know that what was the public interest generated, and did it really satisfy you in the end to blow the whistle?
Yeah, it didn't matter whether it satisfied me. It was the fact that what I knew must be revealed to the public in the end. You can't have a government in secret violating the Constitution on such an extraordinary scale. You can't have the government spending billions and billions in the name of national security and just fraudulent. Okay? You can't have the government hiding, using national security to hide the truth about 9/11 in terms of critical information that had not been shared. So whistleblowing is fundamentally in the public interest. Leaking actually is simply political. It's for political purposes. So Valerie Plame, which was a case during the Bush administration, they wanted to burn Joseph Wilson, her husband, who was an ambassador. He had gone to Niger and found out that there was no yellow cake. It was completely made up by Bush, which was basically the excuse to do the preemptive invasion of Iraq. What I call the tragedy of our invasion of Iraq and all that's happened since. That was purely done for political purposes, right? She got outed as a deep cover agent in the CIA. So in my case, the whistleblowing is truly in the public interest because you have a government that's simply ignoring the law. There are no constraints, and effectively they were hiding behind national security as the way to protect themselves from accountability. And if you're talking about a democratic country, a democratic nation, then something has to give when you've got a government who ends up using secrecy to hide itself from that accountability.
So that's why I want to know that what was the public's reaction? Did they actually support you, or to an average American citizen it didn't really matter? So what, the government is looking at us, it's all right. I need to worry about my job, my daily life.
Yeah. Well, that means that ultimately it does come back to the people. It does. In the end, there is in the United States. I call it "we the people." It does come back.
I think that's a battle that's being fought right now.
But that is precisely the case.
How much people care.
Yeah, and I've said to people many different audiences, what future do you want to keep? Does privacy actually matter? Does the sovereignty of who you are as a human being matter? And the problem is with many governments, the human condition is not kind. I'm well aware of, the history here is bleak in terms of this kind of power. We've had the dark chapters of the 20th century. We can go back to we can point to history in terms of dictatorships. They want to control, they want to suppress, they want to censor. And the technology of today unfortunately allows the government enormous power. And when they do this in partnership with certain corporations that hold enormous amounts of data about us, well, then they get to know a lot about us. Now I've heard the meme. I just want to make sure here because it's something that continues to come up. It's like, well, if I've done nothing wrong, so I have nothing to hide. If I have nothing to hide, I have nothing to fear. The problem is you don't get to make that choice. The government decides in secret as to whether or not you have something to hide. I am a living example of what happens with the evidence the government had, and then which was actually in my favor, and the government deciding, well, because it was in my favor, that they would frame it. They would actually manipulate the data, the evidence, in a way to make it look like I was really a bad guy. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And there is, the fact remains that it's too tempting. This kind of power and secret, it's too tempting. It's enormously seductive. When you have secret power and you have the ability to say, you know what? Yeah, my former girlfriend. I wonder what they're up to today. Or just let's check on some Hollywood actor, actress, or celebrity, right? What can we find out about them? It's too easy for authority to use this information for other purposes. It goes far beyond the bounds of protecting the nation from threats, internal or external. And these are the kinds of things that must be constrained and contained. And these are the debates we're having now. The thing that Edward Snowden finally, and even he wasn't sure what happened, this global debate was ignited.
For him, he felt satisfaction from that. He was like, look, I don't know what the outcome's going to be, but the fact that we're having a global debate about this is what I wanted to happen.
And I had always hoped, given what I revealed within the system, I'd always hoped that a Snowden would come along. And yes, do I take satisfaction in that I served as inspiration, direct inspiration for Snowden to come forward? Yes, I do.
And I take satisfaction that the John Walker Lynn case collapsed, but for me, the real reckoning was years later when Abu Ghraib happened. And I was like, yep, that's what I've been saying for the last 4 years, and it was, Abu Ghraib was a horrible thing, but there was a certain moral satisfaction that, like, thank God the world knows about this now.
And the debate about how much we should care and so on is happening now because of whistleblowing.
I recognize few people stand up. I do know that, and people that stand up, I reckon an enormous cost, an enormous price. You have two people here in front of you, myself and Jesselyn, who faced all kinds. In my case, I ultimately got indicted, facing many, many decades in prison, but we're free. And it is possible, and so you can make a difference.
I'm just curious how many people know how to use encryption too.
Might come to that, but I want to get these questions
that
on
leads
first.
really nicely into what I was going to ask. I was just going to say, with everything that you discovered at the NSA and then with what followed with Snowden, the NSA has been actively monitoring and actively trying to break and sometimes breaking encryption used by Google and everyone. I'm going to take it to the extreme, and you can dial back my hysteria. Should journalists be using the internet?
You've got to protect yourself. Journalists, you'll be engaging in malpractice if you don't engage with your sources or in communication that's unencrypted. I will tell you that right now, because unfortunately the government powers are such that if you don't protect you and your sources or the ability to communicate in an encrypted manner, better yet if it's anonymized, anonymized in terms of the internet space, then you put your source and yourself in extraordinary jeopardy. Unfortunately, this is the climate we're in. You have to protect yourself. It's not well known, but I spend many, many hours setting up people, including journalists, with encryption so they can do their job. And I spend many, many hours with lawyers and attorneys representing whistleblowers and those involved in human rights, in civil liberties, in civil rights, in constitutional rights, with encryption. It's not easy. I've laid down my demands, as it were, given what I experienced. That the encryption is still not good enough. It's not easy. It takes too much to set it up, and there's too many loopholes. Meaning, it's too easy for it to get compromised. But you cannot in today's world. You just can't.
But even in the 1 year of Snowden, I think encryption has become used far more widely, and it's become, even though it's still tricky, it's become easier to use. And I know people are working incredibly hard to make it more user-friendly. And again, like I work in Washington, D.C., so as a lawyer, luckily I can meet most of my clients in person, and I literally will give them documents in person and not send them over the internet. For a client like Snowden, obviously there's a huge high level of encryption involved, and other clients, I would never send a document over open internet that I expect to be attorney-client privileged, because at least the US government's mass domestic surveillance doesn't have a carve out for doctor-patient privilege communications or attorney-client or source and journalist, reporter source, or penitent priest, whatever. Your accountant and a client, you don't have any kind of protection.
I've broken off communication with journalists who refuse to engage in just basic PGP. I said, there's no way,
Blindly,
I'm not gonna
we
communicate
lost
with you at all. And there's journalists that don't communicate with me, and it's unfortunate, because they're writing stories that are in error. They're writing stories that they do not have the benefit of those who lived on the inside and understand what's at stake. And so because they can't set it up properly or aren't able to get their IT department, I mean, I had one who was actually sending me extraordinarily sensitive information. This is even after everything happened. Extraordinarily sensitive information in the clear because it wasn't set up properly. And I found that you can't communicate with me in this manner anymore.
Dan?
I guess I was interested in what is the extent for the two of you, the extent or the particulars of the sort of individualized surveillance that you have been under yourselves, as far as you're aware.
Ooh, well, in a nutshell, I was put under severe surveillance, both physical and electronic. It got to the point in the latter months before that I was actually unceremoniously raided by the FBI in late November of 2007. It was not uncommon at all. Every time I pulled out of the driveway, or as I pulled into the driveway, there'd be 2 cars sitting at the end of the road. In fact, the FBI during my cooperative period made a point of saying, yeah, we knew everywhere you went, Mr. Drake. They were ticked off that they were unable to determine how I ended up meeting with the reporter 5 of the 6 times. The last meeting I know was compromised right before I got raided. They were ticked off because they couldn't follow me. So that should tell you, I've lived the surveillance state. I don't want anybody else to live it. I don't want society to live in a surveillance regime, and for me it's quite personal. I mean, you talk about personal. See, during the latter years of the Cold War, I flew on RC-135s. This is the 1980s. I was a cryptolinguist. I monitored the communications of the Warsaw Pact. The country in which I became an expert was East Germany. That was a surveillance state. I've been to Berlin twice now in the last month and a half. I've been in Stasi headquarters, in the prison, and the Stasi archives. Do we really want society to become a surveillance state? And although clearly the United States and Australia are not East Germany, the former Stasi officers have marveled, drooled, like it's a technology that's at the hands of the security services, far beyond anything they could imagine. This is the stuff that corrupts society. Government, you just can't have this kind of power being given unconstrained without something giving. And I keep talking about, does democracy matter when you have a government who's willing to set aside democratic practices and principles for the sake of security? So if you forsake liberties and freedoms, what are you left with? A security state? That's going to keep us free? So are we going to give up our sovereignty as human beings? That's why the fourth estate, that's why journalism and investigation is so crucial in today's world. One of the interesting paradoxes is you have this enormous amount of data, enormous amount of information now. It works both ways. The government tries to control it because information is the currency of power. And the information also can be used to expose and disclose. You have, historically there's always been this tension, even in terms of US history. But now we have technology that gives the government enormous access to everything there is to know about you. The Stasi motto is to know everything. At NSA, the motto was to collect it all in order to know everything. You actually say collect it all. They told me, when I confronted them directly, in early October, the lead attorney, he said, you don't understand, Mr. Drake, we just need the data. They became obsessed with accessing everything that was possible to access. And they become obsessed with collecting it all. Now what are you going to do with all that? Is there that many threats in the world that you have to basically turn democracy inside out to save the country? That's the old, destroy the village in order to save it? I don't think so. I absolutely object. I just absolutely resist with every fiber in my being. On a very personal level, do you know what it means to truly be free? When you have everything, the government is doing everything they can to take away your own freedoms and your own liberties and your own rights. Remember, all I did was take an oath to support and defend the Constitution. That's all I did, is an ID in how to govern ourselves. And if that idea, we the people, in order to form a perfect union, means anything in terms of the United States Constitution, if that's not worth it, we're willing to set that aside or let the government set it aside, then we deserve the government we keep. You know, and you know, the legislation is before you all in this country. This national security legislation, this amendment, is incredibly is frightening for me. It really is, because it's going to give enormous powers to the government secret, and they're ostensibly saying we need these powers to keep you safe. We need these powers to protect you from what? I mean, it just doesn't end. I mean, this is a deja vu for me. This is the equivalent. This is enabling act legislation that will grant the government license to increasingly erode basic freedoms and rights, and continue to expand the surveillance in a way that they have pretty much gain access to everything there is to know. Why? Because unless they know everything, you know, they can't protect you. You know, I don't buy into that. It's a false dichotomy. I just don't buy into it at all. So the fourth estate becomes absolutely crucial and it has to be really aggressive, because we cannot entrust government. We just cannot with these kind of powers without accountability. And if they're allowed to persist in expanding their powers, because partly it serves their own ends, right? The threats are existential. There's always some new threat on the horizon, or it's a cyber threat, or jihadis coming back. You know, they're going to tear up our society, and we got to defend against it. Well, in our own country, Benjamin Franklin, said it very best, and I'm paraphrasing. He would seek temporary safety. Safety. You can't forsake for the sake of security. You're going to lose both. You give up both. And I fundamentally resist that. The fifth estate, interestingly enough, is you're listening here from two people that really are coming from the fifth estate, because if the press is not doing their job and you're on the inside and you see government wrongdoing in violations of law and ethics, and you step up and step out, then we're the canaries, and we're the canaries. We're the ones that are sounding the alarm, but we're like the last bastion of defense. And if the press doesn't, ultimately the press picked up, right? In her case, it exposed Jesselyn, to much of her detriment. In my case, later on, it became the saving grace.
Which leads me to what's going to have to be a concluding question, right? Because we're out of time, and so that will be cross with me. What makes a good journalist? And just
independence, and actual investigation, and not relying on other people's reporting of certain facts to use your reporting independent verification of it. Working for an institution that supports you, being independent. If you're not a freelancer and you're not working for yourself, working for a paper or a magazine that allows you journalistic freedom to not necessarily toe the party line of whatever the our institution and power happens to be, whether it's a corporation or the government or.
Don't be seduced by power and the access to power. I've seen too many journalists. I've seen journalists that I've had actually regular contact with who give, unfortunately, too much deference to their access to those in power. It's a weird thing, power. It really is. And it's sort of this reality distortion field that, ooh, I got someone in power who's talking to me. Be very careful. Don't believe anything you hear. It's just a weird thing that somehow, if they're in a position of power, which ultimately is about authority, that somehow the authority must be saying something that's legit. They've got you. If you have access to them, they can manipulate you, and you've got to maintain your independence. And it can be tricky. In the United States, there's been this long-standing agreement in terms of national security that if you're about to expose something involving national security, that you go to the government first before you print. And I've objected to that ever since day one. Why would the press, which is supposed to be protected under our First Amendment, an amendment you don't have a Bill of Rights, but here, you as press, you're compromising your own independence by going to the government. And ostensibly, it's this arrangement. Well, just in case we might threaten or the safety of somebody or an operation, let's be sure. The one thing about the Edward Snowden disclosures is really important to note. Extraordinary care has been given to actually going to the government with rare instances to ensure that anything that was about to get published is they had at least a chance, even if it was only a brief period of time, a chance to say why something couldn't be published. But you really got to be careful about power. I mean, I've seen it too often in the last number of years where reporters will claim, well, so-and-so in the government told me this. And without really questioning the authenticity or the truth of it. And yet, looking to the whistleblowers or the truth tellers as a secondary or tertiary or not even a real source. Because they're not in a position of power, because they're not in the government, or they're not inside the corporation anymore, right? Or even if they are, that somehow they're delegitimated.
And that's a good note to end on. I think, although I really do feel we could go on all afternoon productively, but that was exhausting you. If you want to hear more, these two are appearing at the Wheeler Centre tonight in a session that's co-sponsored by the Centre for Advancing Journalism. Sulet Dreyfus up the back there is the woman who's made all this happen, so she deserves a big thank you as well. And in the New News event, which the Centre will be running in October, we will be having a number of sessions both on surveillance of journalists and also on whistleblowing, so I hope you'll all come along to that. And in the meantime, I hope you'll join me in thanking two very brave people who we're proud to co-host today.